considerations and economic?
In a way, it certainly was. But I think I would it wasn't quite as simple as that, because the 2 metre, your observation that the scientists were recommending 2 metres is, of course, correct, or many scientists were recommending 2 metres. Some were not. Some were saying 1 metre was all right. But it was also true that 3 metres would have been better, or 4 metres, 5 metres would have been epidemiologically more effective than 2 metres. It was a question of where to draw the line. And there was plenty of evidence from around the world that other countries had gone from down to 1 metre. There were other international comparators that had done it safely. And so although you're quite correct that hospitality and other sectors were desperate to be able to operate, because it was very, very difficult under the 2 metre rule, it did not seem to me, on balance, to be epidemiologically unsound to do it. And I, of course, had to balance the very considerable hardship that was being caused to people by the effective closure of hospitality as a result of the 2 metre rule.
I posed the question the way that I did because I've actually quoted your own words from the summing up of that Cabinet Office meeting on the 2nd of June. Summing up, the Prime Minister said the underlying scientific advice, so obviously the combination of the various views that you'd received, was that staying 2 metres away from other people remained the best way of reducing coronavirus transmission. There was no doubt about
3 metres would have been even better.
Indeed, but there was no doubt at all that epidemiologically the pre-existing 2 metre rule was the best way to proceed epidemiologically. But you were under understandably intense economic pressure to try to take a different path in order to be able to alleviate the economic burden.
And there were plenty of other countries that had done the same.
That debate took place, of course, in advance of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which was put into place in August, in those mid-week days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of the 4 weeks of August. In your statement, you make plain that you and the Chancellor thought that there was a sound policy rationale for the introduction of the scheme. Were the policy rationales, firstly, the obvious economic support for the hospitality sector, but secondly, to influence social behaviour by incentivising the public to engage more generally in indoors hospitality? That was the thinking.
The thinking was that the country had made a huge effort, that we got the R down below 1, that the disease was no longer spreading in the way that it had been, and that within the budget of risk, it was now possible to open up hospitality. That being so, logically, if we were going to take advantage of that, if we were going to allow people to take advantage of, allow the hospitality sector to take advantage of the freedom that our collective efforts had won them, then it seemed to me to make sense to make sure that they actually had some customers. That was my thinking, and it seemed to me that if it was safe to open hospitality, then it must be safe for people to go to hospitality.
Do you accept, as Professor Edmonds said in his evidence to this inquiry, it's one thing to take your foot off the brake, which is, of course, what had been done in terms of easing the restrictions in June and July, but to put your foot on the accelerator is, by implication, quite different. He, in fact, used the word perverse, but I'm just going to suggest to you that it's a different thing to do.
Utmost respect for Professor Edmonds. All I would say is that at the time that the Eat Out to Help Out policy was being aired with me, for the first time. It did not seem, it was not presented to me as an acceleration, simply something to make sense of the freedoms that we were already giving. And it was not, I must emphasise, it was not at the time presented to me as something that would add to the budget of risk.
But it wasn't being presented to you by the scientists, was it? It was being presented to you by the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The material makes quite plain that they were the ones who proposed the scheme. The paperwork makes that absolutely plain. And at the same time, your Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, in particular at a COVID-S meeting on the 22nd of June, was saying that in general terms, the proposed easing of restrictions with relation to in relation to indoor hospitality was at the top end of the risk boundary. So you knew that there was an element of risk in this. There had to be a degree of epidemiological gamble. That's logical and fair.
I don't think that I thought that scheme in itself was a particular gamble at the time, and it certainly wasn't presented to me as such, nor am I confident that there is very substantial evidence that it did indeed add to the R. Though I defer to what your inquiry has discovered, but I can't see anything that conclusively shows that it made a big difference. At the time, it wasn't presented to me as something that would.
Could we have 232086 pages 1 and then 2? We'll stick with 1 for the moment. This is just to demonstrate, Mr. Johnson, that there was considerable debate between the Treasury and Number 10 in relation to a voucher scheme which became the Eat Out to Health Out scheme. This is an email from the Treasury dated the 22nd of May. It refers to the bottom of the page, the Chancellor asking her to thank all the teams as a meeting with you went very well. You complimented him on doing a great job. And then if we just go over the page to the middle, we can see a reference to presenting a plan for July. And then right at the bottom of the screen, Chancellor clear that should not do options in box at the bottom of the page, e.g. IT cut, people save, not spend, PM very keen on vouchers idea. So there was a general debate going on, obviously and sensibly, for some time before August. And you expressed your optimism, as it's been described, that the scheme was a good idea. The material does indeed seem to indicate that there wasn't a significant increase in infection after the scheme, although there is in the material some suggestion it may have gone up to some degree in different parts of the country, as you might expect. But you knew that the Treasury and HMRC had not in fact sought scientific advice on the epidemiological consequences of the scheme. That must have been apparent to you.
Well, I say in my statement that I thought that Chris and Patrick must have known or did know about Eat Out to Help Out, and I said that because it wasn't a very secret thing. It was I thought a pretty well publicised scheme, and I'm fairly confident that it was discussed several times in meetings at which I believe they must have been present. I understand that they don't feel that they were properly consulted, and I remember being, but I don't quite understand how that can have happened, to be honest. I remember being surprised later, I think it was in September, when Chris says this is Eat Out to help the virus, and I thought that's funny, because I didn't remember any previous controversy about it.
Mr. Johnson, in June and July, you had a number of bilateral meetings with the Treasury and the Chancellor,
Yes.
which the scheme was debated.
Yes.
There were no scientists present at any of those meetings, were they?
No, but it would have been normal for a project like that, a scheme like that, to have gone through the COVID-19 task force, and it seemed to me odd that the scientists hadn't been made aware of it.
So you knew they hadn't been made aware of it. You knew that.
Sorry, I don't think I said that.
It's not what I understood.
It seemed to me odd that the scientists. Oh, I see. Sorry. Do you mean now? It appears.
So I thought it was.
I apologise. I thought you meant at the time. It
So
appeared
yeah,
you
no. So my surprise was in, I think it was something like September 16th or thereabouts. It was quite a long time afterwards when I heard Chris in a COVID-S say, it's eat out to help the virus. And he looked at me meaningfully, and I thought, well, that's funny, because I didn't remember this being something that had previously seemed to attract objection or controversy.
But please, may we be clear about this? No scientists have been present at any of the bilateral discussions
That's
about
correct.
the voucher or what became the Eat Out to Help.
Well, certainly not as far as I can remember.
No. The paperwork, and you've obviously received a number of papers, made no reference, did it, to this scheme being supported or proposed by the epidemiological experts?
It wouldn't. It didn't say that, but that, on the other hand, I wouldn't necessarily have drawn the conclusion from that it had either been opposed or that it had not been discussed with them.
And in your statement, you do say in terms, the scheme was, quote, to use your words, properly discussed, including with Chris and Patrick. So
I did say that, and that was my belief. And I don't understand how that. I don't understand how something as well publicised as that could have been smuggled past the scientific advice. I don't see how that could have happened.
So that we're entirely clear about this, your statement appears to positively suggest that it was properly discussed, including with Chris and Patrick. You're the one who suggests in your statement that the persons with whom it was discussed included the CMO included the CMO and the GCSA. But now today, you're saying you're not sure whether it was discussed with them, and you're surprised that it wasn't. Is that the position?
The reason I said that in my statement is because I frankly assumed that it must have been discussed with them, and I'm perplexed as to how something as significant as that can have got through. I mean, there must have been several meetings of COVID-S and COVID-O, which it was discussed. So
You understand that you make a positive avowal. It was properly discussed. That word "properly" is your word, Mr. Johnson, not the inquiry's.
Well, that's indeed my memory, and I remember the scheme coming up several times, and that's why as I've told you, I was surprised when later I heard that Chris was calling it "Eat Out to Help the Virus." And taken aback.
Enforcement. There was at the same time, of course, a constant debate as to whether or not, in order to promote proper self-isolation, in order to ensure heightened compliance with the guidance and the regulations, further enforcement was required, or whether or not, or perhaps alongside it, additional financial support should be provided. It was an obvious debate that had to be had. Did you have a position in relation to whether or not the cure for lack of compliance or for difficulties with self-isolation should be greater enforcement, tougher enforcement and bigger fines, or for the setting up of a more generous system for financial support for those who were self-isolating? Do you recall?
We did both. We instituted a compensation scheme for payments for those who are self-isolating from September, I think of about £500. But I also took the view that if we were going to have a system of enforcement, then it needed to be pretty firm.
Do you recall whether or not the amount for the payment went up between March 2020 and September? Was there any increase before September, Mr. Johnson? Do you recall?
Well, I remember the top whack fine was £10,000.
Well, indeed. You declared in a handwritten message, a handwritten note on a box note given to you on the 13th of August. I agree with the openings, but the overriding message, you said in capital letters, should be about tougher enforcement and bigger fines. But at the same time, it's notable that you in no way suggested that an alternative way, or perhaps a complementary way, might be to increase the amount of payments for self-isolation.
No, we did, as I've just said, increase payments for self-isolation.
That wasn't a suggestion that you made at this time, although it came in later, as you rightly say, in September. So your position was, it would appear, enforcement is the only way to go.
Well, that's obviously not quite right, because we did give quite generous payments for self-isolation. I think the concern that we had was that there could be difficulties, complications, abuse of any system of payments. We were already spending, as everybody knows, very considerable sums in support of all kinds. So there were anxieties about some of the implications of the compensation system, but because it was so important to go with self-isolation, to encourage people and to help people who needed support, we did go for the £500 payments.
On the regulations and the guidance themselves, evidence has been received by the inquiry from the former Home Secretary, Dame Priti Patel, that in her opinion, there was a high degree of confusion surrounding the broad thrust of the regulations as well as their detail, and the inquiry has seen a diary entry in Sir Patrick Vallance's evening notes where you exclaim in frustration, but plainly perhaps not to be taken too seriously, who made these stupid rules?
Yeah. Look,
was that, against that context, Mr. Johnson, to what extent did your advisers and officials come to you over the summer and the autumn of 2020 and say, there really is a distinct problem about the efficacy and the workability of these regulations? They're very difficult to understand and they're giving rise to a significant degree of confusion. Did that debate ever take place?
We did try to make the rules as simple as we could, but the problem was the effort did to get people to self-isolate, to avoid contact because of the complexities of human life, became extremely complicated. And I think we really need, for the future, to think about how we do it again. Because yes, it was very difficult to enforce. And I do have a great deal of sympathy for those who were the police, those who were charged with enforcing it, because it changed very often. I think there were 60 separate changes, and the complexities for the public to understand were very great.
Have you thought about how it might be done differently next time in terms of the promulgation of the legal superstructure? Well,
I think clearly it'd be a matter for Malay and the inquiry, but I think that there needs to be a great deal of reflection about the simplifying the whole approach and seeing what we can do to rely more on common sense and less on regulation and legislation. But there may be limits to that, and I'm not suggesting there is an easy answer, because the reason fundamentally in the UK why you need, and I say this to all the libertarians, why you need regulation is because ultimately people want to see everybody being obliged to obey the the same set of rules, and they want their neighbours to do what they're doing.
But it must be noted that despite your declared libertarian tendencies, your own message to your advisors, as we see from that document, was bigger fines, more enforcement, a heavier hand.
So here's the picture. I was very concerned. I knew that we were basically in remission as we come out of the first lockdown. I knew, and the reason I go for things like Eat Out to Help Out is because I think it's within the budget of risk. But I know that we're going to face another wave, and I really want people, if we're going to avoid tougher measures, we need people to obey the existing strictures.
It was obvious to you, and we'll look at a WhatsApp in a moment, of course, by the end of July, that the United Kingdom would be hit by a second wave. That was epidemiologically taken for granted in terms of the examination of this viral pandemic. Well, we'll have 48399, page 25. You say it's completely obvious we're about to be hit by a second wave. It's about halfway down, just not halfway down the page. (8:10:48). Folks looking at Spain and France and remembering March, it is completely obvious we're about to be hit by a second wave. And on page 32, a month later, the 31st of August, in the same WhatsApp group, you say, page 32, we've seen the wave coming for miles, so we should be ready. And thank you. It's obvious that the government was concerned in the summer of 2020 with, as you say, the prospect of being hit by a second wave. Did you therefore give consideration to the possibility of putting into place a formal system of segmentation? The inquiry has heard evidence how in August and September, the COVID task force considered whether or not it might be possible in advance of the impact of the second wave to consider a formal system of segmentation for the elderly. Do you recall that debate?
I certainly do, and I think that we were looking at all sorts of different solutions.
There were a number of meetings with the COVID task force. You say in the minutes of a meeting of the strategy committee, COVID-S, in September, a plan should be considered on segmentation of the population to enable a portion of the population to continue to live their lives as normal, that is to say, the remainder. Do you know now, can you recall why the proposals on segmentation were either impractical or not possible to be taken further? Do you remember?
And a lot of people, I kept having to explain this to people, and because intuitively it sounds like a very reasonable thing to do, to protect those who are going to be most vulnerable, principally the elderly and those with chronic conditions. The trouble is that when the R starts circulating above a certain rate, the velocity of transmission of the disease becomes so extreme that it just breaks the segregation that you've tried to impose. And that vulnerable population, a percentage of them, will inevitably get the disease. And as you know, a small percentage of a very large number is a very large number.
So if we look at 48399, which is the CSA, CMO, PM WhatsApp group for August, page 28, you entered into a debate with Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance about the merits of giving the elderly a choice. And you say, in effect, why not give the over 65s a choice? They can decide whether to enter into spontaneous self-preservation and keep themselves, or run the risk of hugging their grandchildren and engaging fully in society. And you put that position to Sir Chris Whitty, and he says in the middle of the page, starting at 7:22:49 p.m, I agree it's entirely reasonable at an individual level And then
it's the second paragraph is the crucial
indeed. He says people can rationally make an informed choice whether they individually would take a small increased risk of dying by hugging their grandchildren or going clubbing, perhaps not the same people both hugging their grandchildren and going clubbing. But at a population level,
This is the
government is under an obligation to ensure that the epidemiological line is held so that the R rate doesn't then go back above 1. Was that the nub of the problem?
That's it. So Chris, in that second paragraph, is making the essential point that even if you've elected to be shielded, or even if the government is trying to shield this segment of the population, it's not going to work because the infectiousness is too great.
And do you think that is why perhaps the segmentation debate didn't lead to any practical proposals? It came up against the possibility of the epidemiological problem.
I couldn't see how it would fix our problem, but it was sometimes a job to explain that to colleagues. But you can see that we didn't pursue it.
Well, it appears to have been quite a job to explain it to you, because you wanted that choice to be given to individuals, and your CMO was saying, don't do that. And
quite rightly, I was interrogating my advisors about points that had been made to me with a view to understanding the arguments and being able to explain them to the world, which is my job.
So by September, in light of what you've agreed, which is that it was obvious that a second wave was coming, you say in your statement, we were going to have to do something. There was this debate about a circuit breaker, you recall. The sage advice to you, relayed by your CMO and your government chief scientific advisor, was to the effect that the more rapidly interventions are put into place and the more stringent they are, the faster the reduction in incidence and prevalence and the greater the reduction in COVID-related deaths. As a general proposition, do you accept that?
That was the advice that they gave then, though, of course, it had changed a bit from where we were in March. Though they were still making the point on the circuit breaker. If you look at that, I think that sage advice in September, they're still saying, if you do one, it may not be enough, and you may have to do another, which was, if you remember, Patrick's point back in March.
So if we look at 102265, page 2, this is a WhatsApp communication on the 17th of September, we can see that Mr. Cummings says we should consider a 2-week circuit breaker, keep schools open but close bars, restaurants, etc. We should consider doing this week. And then he says, sorry, I meant consider now, saying this early next week for a fortnight. You say, what's the difference between a circuit breaker and a national lockdown? And what if it doesn't work? Is that a nod to the point you've just made? The difficulty with a circuit breaker is
it is.
You don't know whether it will work. If it's short, you may run the even worse risk of having to do it again.
Yes. So as I think Patrick said again in one of the meetings, there's the yo-yo risk, and which Sage themselves point to, and I think Matt himself, even though Matt was generally very much on the health secretary, was very much on the precautionary side of the argument, was not actually in favour of a circuit breaker, and I think that was his evidence to you as well, for that reason.
Patrick Vallance at the bottom of the page says, yes, lesson is go fast, go a bit harder than you think you need, go a bit wider in geography. So the scientific or epidemiological advice, Mr. Johnson, was there may be risks, but in the general epidemiological context, in the public health context, the advice is you've got to go the extra mile. And that, therefore, would mean a circuit breaker as opposed to local restrictions or varying degrees of stringent restrictions being applied. But your position was, well, ultimately, I don't think that the epidemiological argument is made out. I want to take a different path, and of course, circuit breakers were not applied.
Yes,
Is that the nub of it?
I want to try to just remind everybody of the context when we're coming out of the first lockdown, because what's happening is that the disease is very diversely spread, shall I say, over the country, and there are parts of the UK where it's barely present. Some places, sadly, Leicester, some parts of the northwest, where they barely came out of restrictions throughout 2020. And so the question would have been, do we continue with national measures the whole time, which would have been which is the logical tendency of some of the submissions I think that you've had. That would just write off 2020.
Slow down, please, Mr. Johnson.
Or do you try what we tried, which is to respect and reflect the geography of the outbreak, and to say, well, we're not going to close hospitality in Devon and Cornwall because of whatever is happening in the West Midlands or elsewhere. And that, for a while, seemed to a lot of people to be a sensible way forward. And I think, I will probably come to this, but I'm trying to the defects in the tiering system. But that led to tiering, and I think it was worth a try because of the difficulties with the circuit breaker concept, which Patrick and Matt and others have alluded to. So that was my hesitation. It wasn't that I was against going into a national lockdown per se, or that I had set my mind absolutely against it. If you look at what I said to the Cabinet in July the 21st, I said, we've got to keep this as part of our arsenal. But I thought that a local approach was a sensible, or regional approach was a sensible way to go, and it was worth trying.
This was a matter of spread of infection and death. To use your words, you thought not having a circuit breaker and then latterly having a tier system was worth a try. Was that the correct approach when dealing with matters of such momentous importance? The scientific advice, and admittedly, Mr. Johnson, the advice is never phrased in terms of you, the Prime Minister, must impose a circuit breaker. It is perhaps a little more coyly expressed in terms of more rapid interventions are required. Go fast, go early, do more.
Yes.
So they gave you, by implication, the room to make the decision yourself. But was that the right approach? Why didn't you apply what you knew to be the lesson learned from March, which is go early, take a precautionary approach, and go the extra mile epidemiologically?
So there were some areas that had outbreaks of the disease that were in very tough measures. And it's not as though we didn't do anything nationally throughout on the contrary. So we ratchet up the measures throughout September and October, and we intensify the pressure on the virus. So September the 9th, we go to the rule of 6. September the 22nd, we go back to working from home and a curfew. October the 14th, we move into the tiering system. Some places go straight into lockdown, and so on. And we intensify the tiering system. And we then go into the full lockdown at the end of the month. And I actually think that programme had a very good chance of working. And if you look at where we were by November, the 22nd, the disease was starting to turn down. Incidence was turning down. And the thing that really threw us off was of course, the Kent variant, the Alpha variant.
But you've now moved further, of course, into November and December. On the 17th of September,
yes,
as this debate indicates quite plainly, Your chief advisor was saying we should consider a 2-week circuit breaker. Your government chief scientific advisor was saying circuit breaker would be for 2 weeks. We can get the paper round tomorrow on that. You can even think about doing it regionally. Your Secretary of State for Health and Social Care was saying if we want to avoid a national lockdown, we need to act fast. We're going in the wrong direction. And your scientific advisor again says go fast. You didn't, however, accept the advice set out there, which was go for the 2-week circuit breaker.
Well, we did go. We went immediately. So a few days later, we go for the working from home and for the curfew. The health
you go for a 10 p.m. curfew, do you not, Mr. Johnson, and advice on working from home?
And the health secretary himself was opposed to, and already, I think by the 22nd of September, 10 million people in a country of 67 million are already in tier 3, effectively in lockdown measures. So it's not as though nothing is happening in that period.
Nobody has suggested nothing was done. There was, of course, the rule of 6. There was the curfew from 10 p.m. There was the package of measures, which you described as the package A measures of late September. But the circuit breaker was not
the national circuit breaker. No, because I wanted to keep going with a regional approach. We had 10 million people in lockdown on the 22nd of September. It was not as though the country was not going through, or large parts of the country were not going through another lockdown.
Well,
the issue was whether there was any support for a continued regional approach. And actually, if you look at the October, even October the 20th cabinet meeting, you'll see that the CMO says that the country, and I think the JVT also, Jonathan Van Tam also said this, the country is basically divided into 3 parts. Those where the disease is flat, those where it's increasing slowly, those where it's rising fast, and a regional approach is therefore still justified. And that is what, as far as I remember, Chris said in that meeting. And so I'm not going to pretend that this was an easy decision, and it certainly wasn't. And it was one I agonized over. But I thought that a regional approach could still save us and could still help us.
You have said twice that part of the rationale for not having a circuit breaker in September was that you said it was not as though the country was not going through, or large parts of the country were not going through another lockdown already. Is this the position? Obviously, from July, there were areas and local restrictions, notably Manchester, Liverpool, and parts of the northwest of England. There was the national rule of 6. There was then the package A measures of the 22nd of September, which was a 10 p.m. curfew and advice to work from home.
Yes.
But the majority of those regions, which, to use your words, were placed in lockdown, were not in fact placed in lockdown unless and until they went into tier 3 in the tier system, which wasn't introduced until the 14th of October.
Yes, but there were there were already restrictions around the country, which were very severe, and they
were not, with respect, comparable to lockdown, were they?
Well, people faced restrictions around the country on the basis of where the disease was prevalent and where it was spreading, and I thought that we'd learnt a lot in that period. We'd seen the horrors of the first wave and the shock of what had happened. You're completely right about that, and it was appalling. And we'd seen the suffering, but we'd also seen the impact of the pandemic, of the measures that we'd taken. And our objective remained the same, which was to protect the NHS and save life, and our strategy was to use NPIs. But it seemed to me, given the disparity in the prevalence across the country, it seemed to me for that period that a local approach was worth pursuing. And in justice and fairness, a lot of people thought the same, because they thought the disease is not prevalent here. It is not circulating in my community. Why am I being locked down? And we had to address that issue as well.
But the other people who thought the same, Mr. Johnson, were not the Prime Minister with access to this epidemiological public health advice, which appeared to be pointing in that direction.
Some of it did, and some of it, as I have just said, continued to support a regional approach.
Is that why you called for the meeting on the 20th of September in Downing Street with Professor Gupta, Professor Hennigan, Anders Tegnell of Sweden, I think the state epidemiologist, and also Professors Edmund and McLean, because you wanted to have a greater diversity of scientific advice, and at least advice beyond the advice which you were receiving, but which you were not inclined to accept from your own chief medical officer and governmental chief scientific advisor?
I think, with great respect, it was the other way around. What I could say, this is towards the end of September, middle of September, and I can see that things are going to deteriorate. There's no question, and I can see the direction of travel. I still want to use tough local measures to try to achieve what we need to achieve, but I can see that, as I've told Cabinet, and as I think I've told the public as well, we're probably going to have to go back into national measures. And what I want to, and I know that when I do that, whenever it comes, there will be, of course, a lot of downsides. And people are going to complain and to object for all sorts of good reasons. I need to have the arguments. I need to understand what a lot of people talk about, the great Swedish success, and how they managed to do it without lockdowns. And if I'm going to impose another lockdown in the course of the next few weeks, which is indeed what I ended up having to do, I need to know what the counter arguments are.
Mr. Johnson, your government and you personally had declared that you would be following, by which you mean you'd be guided by the science. Throughout the course of that year, you had been guided by, accordingly, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies and by your CMO and GCSA. Why did you not continue to follow, to be guided by that advice in September 2020? Why did you deliberately allow yourself to depart from that stated position?
First of all, because the scientific advice was not clear. There was a push for a circuit breaker, but that was not supported by the health secretary, as he's testified to you, and he was normally in amongst the toughest in wanting to impose lockdowns. There were question marks about the circuit breaker and its efficacy, and indeed, where a circuit breaker was tried, as you know, in Wales, it's not clear that it actually worked. So
that was later. It wasn't, of course, imposed until October.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that there were perhaps legitimate grounds for thinking that a circuit breaker was not a panacea, and I was keen to continue with a local or a regional strategy which continued to have scientific support for being reasonable, as I've said.
The nature of the specific intervention may not have been absolutely clear, because SAGE posed the issue to you in terms of interventions being required. But the debate was plainly, and you understood it to be plainly, about the merits of a circuit breaker. So there was a clarity about the debate. What lacked clarity was what ultimately, what political decision should be made by you. You were unclear as to what the way forward should be. The meeting on the 20th September...
That's not true. For great respect, what we decided to do was to continue to tighten the measures that the national measures that we had, but also on October the 14th to go for the tiered system.
On the 20th of September, you deliberately arranged for a meeting at which you allowed yourself to hear from scientists on either side of a completely different debate, which was not to do with the merits of a circuit breaker, but to do with whether or not, as a general policy, the Great Barrington approach, that's to say, to use another word, another expression, the let it rip approach should be applied, or whether or not the general approach of caution should be applied. That was the debate on the 20th of September.
No, well, actually, I don't remember people discussing the Great Barrington Declaration, but
the approach which is later reflected.
Well,
in the Great
what was so
Barrington
interesting about the debate on the 20th of September, to which, as you can imagine, I listened with great care, was that actually the scientists who had been billed as, to use your words, the Let It Rip brigade, did not really support that approach. And the longer the conversation went on, I was fascinated to see how actually they migrated towards a precautionary approach and towards the understanding that MPIs were inevitable and necessary, and that you had to do something. So the question. So I was really interested in. I was thinking ahead in that conversation. I was thinking ahead to where we were going to end up in a few weeks' time, and I wanted to fortify myself against the types of arguments that you've mentioned.
So bluntly, although you had been given to understand that Anders Tegnell, who was the state epidemiologist for Sweden, would probably recommend a more herd immunity style approach, turned out, to your surprise in the meeting, to argue, in fact, for a stronger intervention.
He didn't. I wouldn't say that. No, not. Sorry. Let me be clear. I don't remember him or anybody making any particular comment about, tiers versus lockdowns or whatever. But what I do remember is a surprising degree of unanimity, given the divergence in views that I've been led to expect.
Yes. He may not have mentioned, and there's nothing to suggest he mentioned circuit breakers or lockdowns or tiers, but in the general conceptual debate about the precautionary approach and the need for stronger intervention, Anders Tegnell made it absolutely plain to you that, contrary to much of the press reporting about the Swedish approach, a stronger intervention was merited if the approach to be adopted by your government was, there's a second wave coming, we need to do more to stop it. That was the approach he took in the meeting, wasn't it?
I couldn't swear to that, Mr. Keith. What I remember is that everybody, and everybody at the meeting was. I mean, it was more abstract, I think, than concerned with the details of the current UK position, about which actually I don't think they necessarily. Some of them knew or I don't think.
Is that right? You received one-page papers from every single attendee about inviting them, and they produced information about the approach that the United Kingdom government should adopt.
Well,
do you recall?
I don't remember them commenting specifically on the situation that we were in. What I do remember is there was a much greater uniformity of view that we needed to do something. What I'm trying to say to you is that if you're saying to me that Anders Tegnell said you've got to lock down now, that wasn't.
I have not suggested that to you, Mr. Johnson.
Well, that's not what I remember anyway.
At a COVID-S meeting on the 21st of September, the following day, you said, and the minutes record that you said, the events of the spring showed that the consequences of making decisions too late. So you were well aware of the need to get on and make decisions and to avoid the mistake of the spring,
yes,
which is
course.
to leave the most stringent interventions to the last minute. Correct?
Well, the mistake of the spring, if you remember, was that we'd mistaken our place on the curve, and that was, but we were in much less doubt about that now.
The mistake in the spring was making a decision too late. The fact that one of the reasons for the decision, for that mistake, Mr. Johnson, may have been a misunderstanding as to where we were on the epidemiological trajectory is quite different, is it not?
No, we couldn't have made the decision earlier because the facts as we understood them were different.
Your summary in that meeting.
Sorry, you're both losing
I'm so
me.
sorry.
No, you're both
Talking
losing
over
me.
each other.
Exactly, that may be part of the problem. But also, can we make sure that we know which period we're talking about? Because we've been talking about the spring and the autumn. Just to be clear.
In the autumn, I suggested to you, you had said in a COVID-S meeting, the 21st of September, by reference back to the spring, the events of the spring showed the consequences of making decisions too late. Regardless of why those decisions were taken, Mr. Johnson, what were the consequences of making decisions too late? Your reference.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Sorry. So, just to clarify this point, in the spring we couldn't have made the decision any earlier because we didn't know the relevant facts. When it came to the curve in September, October, we were much more on top of it. We could see where it was going. And the relevant facts are that the virus was not evenly distributed across the country. And that was the key thing. It looked as though it might be in abeyance for a long time in parts of the country, and therefore it made little sense to lock it all down. And what we were trying to find, and you can criticise us for this, but I think it was reasonable. We were trying to find a way through that allowed as much of the country as possible to keep going.
Mr. Johnson, what were the consequences of making decisions too late? When you said those words to your colleagues on the COVID-S meeting on the 21st September, what did you have in mind by consequences and the decision making having been too late?
Clearly, if you make any decision too late, then there's going to be a cost, and in the case of COVID, there's a cost in human life. But what I wouldn't accept is that the decision in all the decisions in September, October, November were too late. Nor would I accept, knowing what we did then, that the decision in March was too late.
Well, there we are. On the 22nd of September, you announced the Package A measures. You recall that you were presented with a paper which had Package A measures, the majority of which were described in the very same paper as being unlikely to bring R below 1, some Package B measures, Package C measures, the more stringent, plus the possibility of a circuit breaker. And you went for all the Package A measures and some of the Package B. So largely, the measures which your own CMO had advised would be unlikely to work even in combination to bring R below 1. But that was your right. You announced that your government would not listen to those who say, let the virus rip, nor to those who urge a permanent lockdown when you announced those measures. But the phrase, let the virus rip, and the notion that you as a government would let the virus rip was your own phrase, was it not?
Well, so No, I'm sad to say there were plenty of people who had used the phrase in conversation with me. I was trying to represent a view which was sadly quite widespread, which was that, as you've said already, the approach might be to segment the most vulnerable and to protect them, and to allow the vast majority of the population who were much less vulnerable to gradually acquire immunity. Now, that was not, as we've discussed repeatedly, an approach that I could take at all. And I was saying that in order to explain to the public why it was not an approach that we were taking, any more than going into permanent lockdown was an approach that we could take. We faced an appalling... The problem with this whole period is that we had come out of... We'd found a way out of lockdown, and we'd got the R below 1, but we didn't yet have either good enough therapeutics or a vaccine. And so our only tools remained NPIs. And the question was, do you go straight back into lockdown, which is what a circuit breaker is? I mean, a circuit breaker sounds like a pretty it's a glib phrase. It actually means an immensely difficult, costly exercise, which falls hardest on the poorest and neediest in society. You then might have to do it again and again. And there's no guarantee that it's going to work. And you don't know what the end state is because you've got no vaccine. And that was why I thought it was sensible to continue to throw everything we had at a combination of intensified national measures plus the regional system, the tiering system.
My question to you was whether or not you, whilst announcing that you would not listen to those who had said, let the virus rip, had used the words used the words yourself. You deny that. So could you please look at the diaries?
Sorry, what I'm saying is that this was a phrase in common parlance at the time, and remains so.
Sir Patrick Vallance's diary is 273901, page 92.
Yes, sir.
Actually having a discussion, a meeting with the PM about, quote, letting it rip, page...
But I don't wish to be
I'm just going to put...
repetitive, but this is exactly what you'd expect me to be talking about at this stage.
Page 245.
This is June 2020.
I'm going to show you all the ones, Mr. Johnson, out of fairness. The Prime Minister meeting begins to argue for letting it rip, saying, yes, there will be more casualties, but so be it. They've had a good innings. 608. Perhaps that's the same. 439. We should let it rip a bit. 150. He's obsessed with older people accepting their fate. 230. Obsessed with the average age of death being 82, which is longer, you believe, than the average life expectancy. Get COVID, live longer, you said. 245. Back to the other one. You say at the bottom of the page, according to Sir Patrick Vallance, we're in a really tough spot, a complete shambles. I really don't want to do another national lockdown. You are told that if you want to go down this route of letting go, you need to tell people, you need to tell them you're going to allow people to die. Was your position, Mr. Johnson, that in light of your views secretly held about people dying having reached their time anyway, that you were obliged to reject the advice of your advisors that there be a circuit breaker?
No.
That there be no national lockdown until the last possible moment?
No.
And that you would try
rubbish.
a tier system?
No. No. So the implication of the implication that you're trying to draw from those conversations is completely wrong. And my position was that we had to save human life at all ages, and that was the objective of the strategy. And by the way, that is what we did. If you look at what we actually did, never mind the accounts that you have culled from people's jottings from meetings that I've been in. If you look at what I actually said and what I actually did, and there is abundant quotation from me, millions of words that I spoke in Parliament or in press conferences or whatever. If you look at what we actually did, we went into lockdown as soon as we could the first time round, and we sensibly went for a regional approach when the disease picked up again, and then again went into lockdown on the 30th, 31st of October. And I think, frankly, it does not do justice to what we did, our thoughts, our feelings, my thoughts, my feelings, to say that we were remotely reconciled to fatalities across the country, or that I believe that though it was acceptable to let it rip. What I was asking, and I had to do this, I had to, and we covered a lot of this yesterday, but I had to challenge the consensus in the meeting. You've got to understand that these meetings comprised an overwhelming number of very, very talented, brilliant public health officials, civil servants, and so on, and scientists. And I was representing the only layperson in the meeting. Well, apart from the occasion there would be other politicians, but I was basically, I had to speak for everybody who wasn't in the meeting and who wanted these points put to the scientists before I went out to explain them. I had to get their version of why this wasn't the case. Why wasn't it true that as people were continuously saying in the media and elsewhere, that it was the answer was to shield the elderly, protect the elderly, and to let it rip otherwise. I needed to have the counter arguments. And if you want to look at what I thought, why don't you look at what I actually said in cabinet and what I did? And by the way, well, sorry, I don't want to interrupt your question.
It's obvious, Mr. Johnson, that you were not minded at all times, all the time, to accept the scientific advice that you were being provided with, and that it was absolutely your right. It's notable that there was, analogously to SAGE and the CMO and the GCSA, no economic advisory body, no economic analysis being provided to you in a formal structure that could have provided a foundation for the alternative side of this debate. That is to say, well, Prime Minister, you've got a great deal of evidence here, epidemiologically and in public health terms, but you've got a terrible decision to have to make again, whether or not to impose a lockdown. And that engages the debate with which we're all familiar and with which you are anxiously grappling, which is the damage on the economy.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Keith, I thought Mr. Johnson said yesterday he did have that kind of analysis. It came from the Treasury.
I was going to say, thank you, my lady.
Yes, no, but my suggestion is a formal economic stage, a formal body, advisory group, rather than just the Chancellor and the HMT directly.
I've thought about that, and I think, and that's it's a suggestion that I hope I bet you're going to look at. But I think that actually, and I was going to say this at the end, I'll say it now. I think that the cabinet government, there's a reason it's evolved in this country in the way that it has, and I think that the Treasury representing the economy, the Department of Health representing health, actually worked pretty well after a while. I mean, I think it was a great shock adjusting to COVID, but I think that the way it worked was pretty good. Departments did what they needed to do.
These debates, Mr. Johnson, and there are hundreds of meetings at which the CMO and the GCSA attend, and where the epidemiological evidence is provided to you, takes place in the Cabinet Office room,
The cabinet room, yeah.
the Cabinet room, or the Cabinet Office room, or your study. It's not taking place in Cabinet. Mr. Cummings has described how the Cabinet process, the debate in Cabinet, was more politically excitable, more...
Performative?
Thank you. Performative. How there were worries about leaks, where it was more a matter of political theatre, and therefore there wasn't the opportunity, for the reasons he explains, to have this sort of debate and to consider in detail the sort of advice about which we're
I think that's certainly a fair criticism of some cabinet meetings. But as time went on, and I genuinely think that cabinet proved to be more and more valuable, and you genuinely started to have different points of view properly represented around the table, and different departmental interests, particularly HMT, properly represented, and it became a much more. I started to see the wisdom in the system, and I think it worked.
Perhaps one further question before the break, if my lady wishes it. 236586 is an email from the Principal Private Secretary to the Chancellor in the Treasury concerning one of your regular bilateral meetings with the Chancellor. You, as Prime Minister, plainly had a large number of bilateral meetings with him, Mr. Sunak, and there is a reference in the first paragraph of the email from the Principal Private Secretary to the following the inconclusive strategy meeting, so a strategy meeting, perhaps a wider strategy meeting in government, the Prime Minister and Chancellor met and discussed the plan for the NPI easements on Friday. So you and your Chancellor meet privately, and by privately I mean in the absence of Cabinet, in the absence of other Secretaries of State or civil servants outside Number 10 and HMT, and you discuss plan for NPI easements, so a public health issue. No other minister included shows the strength of the Chancellor's voice in these discussions. So with reference back to my earlier question about a more formal, open, perhaps transparent process of enabling the Prime Minister to receive economic advice, do you think that these private bilaterals, where you discuss with the economic voice in government, the Chancellor, matters of public health, were the right way to have done this?
I can't remember the meeting that I think it's Elizabeth Perelman is referring to.
It's a normal bilateral.
These would be normal conversations that I would have with Rishi. You'd expect me to have them. The plan for NPI easements that she refers to is not something that we have devised at this meeting. It's something that we're discussing, and presumably we're discussing the funding implications or the economic implications of what's envisaged.
Well, there are references to SAGE, there are references to MPI. It's obviously a public health argument or debate.
Yes, it is. But what we're everything in that period related to public health, absolutely. And so we would have been talking about, I imagine, what the Chancellor's views were, and I would have been listening to what he had to say.
And finally, there is evidence, both from Mr. Sunak's own witness statement and also from Mr. Warner, Ben Warner, as well as actually Mr. Cummings, that the Treasury's analytical capabilities would have been assisted by a more formal system of cost-benefit calculation. And just pause there, please, Mr. Johnson, before answering. In your strategy update comments, we'll come to this in a moment, but in response to the final paper, or one of the final papers before the second national lockdown from the COVID task force, you wrote in your handwritten annotations at the end, in capital letters, "Can I please see some serious economic analysis?" Is there a case, by way of one of the many lessons to be learned, for a formalised system of cost-benefit calculation so that the Treasury and the wider world can see how there can be a quantitative analysis of the impact of interventions economically?
Well, the Treasury does a phenomenal amount of cost-benefit analysis, as you can imagine, already. And yes, I think that, as I've said already, my lady, I think what we really need to have is some proper quantified analysis of the benefits of NPIs and the epidemiological benefits of NPIs, because I think there's still too much uncertainty about those, as well as a proper understanding of the economic costs. So yes, I think if there could be some way of putting those two things together in a formalised way, that might very well be useful. But that was effectively what I was doing the whole time, week in, week out. Those were the calculations we were making. But I want to stress that the objective was always saving life, and that was what we were trying to do.
That's your final question before the break.
That's my final question before the break.
11:30, please.
All rise.
Mr. Keith.
Mr. Johnson, the tier system,
Yes.
about which you've spoken, thank you. Briefly, you received advice from the COVID task force on the 7th of October, just to put this in its chronological place. There was a discussion in number 10 that day about regional lockdown measures. A major meeting on the 8th of October,
Yes.
yourself, the Chancellor, CMO, GCSA, and the Chief Executive of the NHS, Simon Stevens. The evening notes kept by Sir Patrick Vallance talks about the somewhat desperate nature of or the anxious nature of the decision having to be made by you and the issues which you've ventilated, which were troubling you. The evidence from the COVID-0 meeting of the 11th of October is that the government chief scientific advisor made plain, because he says it in terms, that the level 3 baseline, that's to say the standard level 3, but the highermost level 3 level, was highly unlikely to bring the R below 1, and so highly unlikely to control the growth of the epidemic. Is that why you said earlier, and you've said it in your statement, you felt the tier system was nevertheless worth a try? There were doubts expressed before you even announced it as to whether or not it would work, but your assessment, and it was ultimately for you to decide, your assessment was it was worth the shot.
It was, and it wasn't just my assessment. I think that even after that meeting, as I said earlier, on the 20th or so, you've got continuing scientific corroboration of the rationale behind the regional approach. But what we wanted was, of course, to try to stamp on the virus, to wallop it wherever it was most prevalent. The difficulty was that it was very laborious and it involved some very difficult negotiations. Understandably, with areas that had been in restrictions for a very long time, and their leaders, understandably, wanted proper financial help. And to get the tougher measures put on was proving, in a voluntary way, was proving time-consuming and costly.
Is it right to say that there was continuing scientific corroboration for the tiers? The material in COVID-0 was the fact that even the highest level, level 3, would be unlikely to work. Sir Patrick Vallance's notes make plain that at that meeting, he felt he's being asked to approve measures knowing that they weren't enough. And the public health epidemiological support appeared to be quite slim. However, the scientists and the public health experts recognised that the public health issue was only one half of the debate. It was for you to weigh up the many issues that you've described, including the economic considerations, and to balance them. That wasn't their call; it was your call.
Well, I had to balance them, but there were two things. I think it was so. I was fortified by what I think the CMO said in the cabinet of October the 20th, where I'm fairly certain that he said something, and JVT said something at about the same time, to the effect that a regional approach was still reasonable. What we wanted out of the tiering system, and we've got to be clear, we didn't achieve it, was really to crush the virus where it was most prevalent. And I've explained that one of the difficulties was, getting local leaders to put in measures fast enough. I think it's possible, and I think that there's even some evidence from Patrick that we had a fighting chance of getting the R below 1 if we'd been able to get some of those measures put in harder and faster in those areas. I think it might have worked, and there are other people who think that too.
The point, Mr. Johnson, is you can't rely upon what was said on the 20th of October about the general nature of regional restrictions, because you made the decision to go for tiers on the 11th of October, over 8 days before, and the announcement was made on the 12th of October.
Yes, but
So what was said, what was said subsequently on the 20th of October in relation to the merits of regional restrictions can't be relied upon as a justification for your decision-making 10 days before.
With great respect, I think what it shows is that there was, around that time, there was continuing scientific support, as I took it, for. I'm just giving you what I felt. Support for a continued regional approach, and by the way, it was also my feeling that although the suggestion from Sage had been for a circuit breaker, I didn't feel, listening to the arguments, and this may have been my mistake, but I didn't feel, listening to the arguments, that the pressure for a circuit breaker was particularly strong, and that may be my mistake, but it wasn't coming from the health secretary, and it seemed to me that there were countervailing arguments as well.
In the event, the tiers, as we know, didn't work.
Well, they didn't, and I'm very sad about that. But I think that they were logically, rationally, as we came out of the restrictions in the summer, they were worth a try. The trouble was that they became very invidious as between areas, because one village would suddenly find itself in very heavy restrictions, and the village next door was not, while the incidence of the virus was exactly the same. Local politicians of all kinds became very worked up, sometimes quite paranoid about the tiering approach. It clearly was proving divisive and difficult to implement. Though I want to say that Eddie Lister, who was in charge of the negotiations, did a heroic job in trying to get government to local government to regional government to agree.
And in addition, the evidence would appear to suggest, of course, as ever, a matter for my lady, that not only were there problems that you've identified, Mr. Johnson, but as Mr. Ridley has said, the process overall was entered into extremely quickly, which gave rise to problems of its own.
Yeah.
The negotiations were difficult and prolonged, and of course, when dealing with epidemiological exponential growth,
and the virus isn't interested in all this. And the virus
indeed, and also logically, because the virus was spreading, ultimately, as proved to be the case, it spread to all areas, and therefore there was a degree of, it's been described as epidemiological levelling up. Everywhere would have to eventually go up into tier 3, and that would, of course, defeat the whole purpose of it.
That's completely right.
All right.
I think that's a pretty fair summary.
Mr. Hancock told the inquiry that he knew on the 14th of October when you announced, the 12th of October when you announced the tier system, that it wouldn't work. Did he tell you that?
Not to my knowledge, not that I can remember.
We then come to the lead up to the second lockdown. It does appear that the COVID task force provided a forward strategy document for you on the 25th of October, and there was a meeting in Chequers to discuss it. You then received a further task force advice on the 28th of October, and then another paper for a COVID-0 meeting, and then there was ultimately a meeting at which you decided that there had to be a lockdown. And my question is this: why were there a number of papers and strategy documents given to you in the same week, all broadly recommending a lockdown? It rather looks as if the COVID task force was trying to bring you to a particular conclusion.
I don't know the answer to that. I do remember the papers, and I think it was the James Bowler paper that I got on the 28th, for instance. There was a lot of good papers. The COVID task force, by the way, was determined to make the tiering system work. They thought we began full of hope that it could work, but it was clear by the end of the month, towards the end of the month, that it was just running out of road.
Let me be more direct. Mr. Shafi's notes of a meeting on the 25th of October, the forward strategy meeting, record you as recognising that the country was in a very tough spot. You say, according to him, that you're deeply sceptical about a national lockdown, and you say, we're not, or I'm not going to be stampeded into a national lockdown yet. That's over the weekend. Then 3 days later, the task force comes to you and says the situation is continuing to deteriorate. We don't think the tiers are working. There's got to be a lockdown. And the point I make to you is to what degree, if any, do you assess that the COVID task force was trying to impose on you, or in trying to recommend a lockdown, because it was aware that you had already said on the 25th, I'm really not going to be stampeded this time.
Yeah. But it was quite right not to be stampeded into any course of action. But the virus, irrespective of the COVID task force, the virus was spreading, and it was spreading exponentially, and that was clear from what James Bowler had to say, and that was clear for a long time, that it was spreading in areas where it had seeded. We wanted to try the tiered approach. We wanted to try the local approach. That was gradually running out of road, and we had to go for national measures. But I always knew that was on the cards.
Having tried measures which didn't prove to work, having been told from July that a second wave was inevitable, do you accept that there is at least a good argument that the tier system should have been conceptualised and put into place earlier, at a time when the prevalence was lower, and therefore the tier system may have been more likely to work, so for September? Alternatively, that a circuit breaker should have been applied in September so as to avoid, possibly, and we will never know, possibly the second devastating national lockdown which you were forced to apply.
So on the point about the circuit breaker, I think we've been round that quite a bit. There were arguments for and against. It wasn't actually presented to me as something that we urgently needed to do. It was an option. The health secretary was against it, and there were clear downsides because of the problem of bounce back. And people, as I say, a circuit breaker is not just flipping things on and off. It's a very, very a massive intervention. You've got to get it right. And
like a lockdown,
and it's a complete lockdown. So, and on the your point about tiering, should tiering have been introduced earlier and formalised earlier, which is, I think, what you asked. That's an excellent question. I think that the truth is that we already, for a long time, had a kind of tiering, in the sense that some places remain. Leicester, the Northwest, remained under measures for a long time. It took a while. I'll be honest. It took a while to work out the LCAL system, and to work out how to move places up and down. And I think one of the lessons of the whole experience is that when you set up these artificial boundaries between epidemiological areas in using council boundaries or whatever, you're going to create huge problems, and or parliamentary constituents. You're going to create huge problems, and we ran into those. And I say in my statement, I don't think that it, in the end, worked, but logically, it appeared to be the right way to go as we came out of the first lockdown.
And do you accept, Mr. Johnson, that the position that was ultimately reached was that you did have and you imposed a roller coaster lockdown process overall? Epidemiological evidence has been given to this inquiry to the fact that if you impose lockdown, circuit breakers, whatever they may be called, earlier, there is a greater chance you can get on top of the virus earlier. You then don't need to have such a long circuit breaker or lockdown. And when you come out, prevalence is likely to be lower, thereby obviating the need for yet another lockdown.
The answer,
if you just let me put the question. The evidence suggests that if, however, you wait to the last minute before imposing a lockdown, you have more of a pronounced roller coaster approach, and prevalence is unlikely to be as low as it would otherwise be, and the lockdown, in order to work, has to be longer, harder, and more brutal.
Right.
That's what you ended up with.
No. So, a lot of points there, if I may. So, first of all, we didn't delay and then do something at the last minute as though there were. So neither in March nor in September, October did we do one single lockdown. And I think this is one of the most important points that people need to remember because it's been slightly forgotten. In March, there are a crescendo of measures beginning in I think on the 9th when I first tell people to avoid contact and so on. There's school closures, hospitality closures, non-essential retail closure and so on. Then the lockdown on 23rd. When it comes to September, October, again, there's a series of steps that we take nationally in addition to the regional measures. Now, and I've described them, the 9th of September, the rule of 6, the 22nd of September, working from home curfew, so on. Then the tiering system, then lockdown. Now, the question about whether the actions helped change the shape of the curve, I think that they did. I hope that they did. I believe that they did. But epidemiologists will have, and I think it's one of the most important things that the inquiry has to evaluate, in my view, is the exact extent to which those NPIs deflected the progress of the virus. What I also think is that if you look at what happened, particularly the second curve, the second wave, it's very interesting that the first it's two parts to it, and the first wave you can see that the collective impact of what we're doing from September onwards, because we're following it very closely by this time, does bend the curve. And again, I will leave it to you to evaluate the exact extent to which that worked and that happened, because that's the crucial thing. We need to explain it properly. But then what happens, as I said earlier on, is that you get alpha, and that we hadn't budgeted for. And that's why the second curve describes the shape that it does.
And would you just explain what the significance of alpha was in terms of its additional transmissibility?
Yes, well, alpha is alpha is the Kent variant, which was identified in early December. I don't know why we called it the Kent variant. It didn't originate in Kent, but it was much more transmissible than the original coronavirus.
To a very large extent, is this right? The emergence of the alpha variant swept all the pre-existing considerations before it away, because
yes, so
transmissibility meant that the government's room for manoeuvre was very much more constrained thereafter.
That's right. So when you talk about a roller coaster, I would say that that roller coaster was very largely driven by nature. The extent to which we were able to control the roller coaster is something that I think we all need to focus on.
Well, indeed. The roller coaster was plainly evident from November, hence the lockdown. The Kent Alpha variant did not make itself plain until the first 3 or 4 days in December.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So what's happened with the measures that we put in, as I said to my lady before, in that second wave, it actually looks, and I remember Matt telling me this, as though we've started to get the numbers under control again, and that was encouraging. And so it was unbelievably depressing when we got Alpha.
There was a small margin for discretion, as far as you could see it, in December, because there was some way of trying to delay the more stringent measures that would be required as a result of the Alpha variant. There was Christmas to consider.
Yeah.
Obviously, the prevalence level of the virus, the rate of transmission, was still relatively high in December, although the November lockdown had, of course, brought it down significantly, but not to the same level as it had been brought down to in May. And therefore, there was no possibility, was there, of opening entirely in December. There had to be fairly stringent restrictions applied, continue to be applied, whatever view you reached of the public health crisis.
Yes,
Is that a fair summary?
Yes. So our initial plan, as you know, was to open up on December the 2nd, which indeed we did. We then see incontrovertible evidence of Alpha, and we know we're basically heading for a lockdown, a full lockdown in January, which is what we do.
There was a debate, of course, about the degree to which you could ease to the limited extent that you could in December.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind your very clearly stated wish that as much could be done as possible to allow families to spend Christmas together.
We did have that debate, though. If you remember what happened, it just became untenable because of the spread of Alpha, and London and a lot of the rest of the country went straight into Tier 4, as we called it.
I need to ask you, Mr. Johnson, to what extent your decision-making in the middle of December was influenced by the press or your backbenchers, because there are references in the Patrick Vallance diaries to you saying that the view of your backbenchers was to take a particular path. You were minded to agree with them. You appeared instinctively to resist the further reintroduction of the ultimate lockdown measures.
No,
is there any truth to that?
It's certainly true that, as I've said before, that in the course of meetings, I would, as I thought was my job, and I believe was rightly thought was my job, I would express the general view of not just of backbenchers, but of other cabinet ministers who might not be in that meeting about what we were doing, and to try to set up some challenge in the conversation.
On the 2nd of January, Michael Gove sent you a private note expressing his views, essentially to the effect that there was no alternative but to adopt a strategy of maximum suppression, as he put it. Did that note, which perhaps traversed well-trodden ground, change your views as to what should be done on the 4th of January? No,
I mean, we'd already basically knew that. I was grateful to Michael for his note, but we already knew that we were, again, we just had to take the toughest measures that we could.
How did the last minute change in relation to whether or not schools, as opposed to secondary school, schools not going back at all, as opposed to just primary schools going back?
It was terrible.
Arise.
It was terrible. I mean, it was.
How did it happen?
It was just it was inevitable because if you remember in the October-November lockdown, we've kept the schools open because of the massive detriment to people. You know, and it's always the most vulnerable families. It's the poorest kids who come off worst from school closures, and that was definitely the case. We'd seen that in the first lockdown without a shadow of doubt. So we were desperate to keep schools open. Yes, did I fight in my heart and head to keep schools open? Yes, I did, and I really wanted to do it, but it just wasn't. It wasn't a runner, and we had to lock everything down.
How hard did you fight in your heart and head, Mr. Johnson? I ask because Mr. Williamson says in his witness statement that when he and you attended the cabinet meeting on the 4th of January, he made clear that he didn't think, of course, he's the Secretary of State for Education, he didn't think schools should close again. If they had to close, then they must be opened again by February half term. And he says, I didn't have complete autonomy to make core decisions, especially those regarding school closure and school reopening. So to a significant extent, the views of the Secretary of State for Education were overridden.
There were, and
your cabinet approved the changes.
I listened respectfully to what cabinet had to say, and indeed many colleagues who thought that we should try to keep schools open, and I just couldn't. You know, the fact is that sadly schools are terrific reservoirs of the virus, and in the cold winter months. They were going to be a big vector of transmission for elderly people, and it wasn't a runner.
Now, may we move forward, in fact, almost a year to Omicron
Yes.
in 2021. Without going into the details of the somewhat arcane and complex issue of Plan A and Plan B
Yes.
and Plan B plus, was this the position from the beginning of December, or the end of November and the beginning of December? The Omicron variant became apparent. Steps you declared to Cabinet had to be taken to protect the public from the variant. For good precautionary reasons, a plan was devised and put into place, which essentially meant moving from the pre-existing Plan A to a Plan B. And you told COVID-O on the 8th of December that there seemed little option than to implement Plan B. The reality was that we were running out of road. The choice was to go ahead with Plan B or to wait and be faced with more concerning data and a rise in hospitalizations. Is that a fair summary?
I think that sounds right, yes.
And what was it that took place in the course of the middle and later part of December that meant that you didn't have to go to Plan B plus, which was right back up to the more severe interventions? In fact, probably a level 4
That's
lockdown.
Right. Well, I think this was one of those occasions, possibly rare, when I felt that I'd got I was flattering myself, but I felt I'd got a pretty good handle on the data by then, and I was watching it very, very closely, and particularly the IFR in the Gauteng province of South Africa, where Omicron was very prevalent, and what we were studying was the extent to which Omicron translated into deaths. And of course, everyone is a tragedy. But if the ratio was starting to diminish, as it seemed to be, then that was very significant. And so we were all. I'm not claiming any credit for myself, but we were all watching this very closely. And I thought that it seemed to. The data that we were seeing from South Africa seemed to me to suggest that Omicron was less deadly, and considerably less deadly. And I didn't know this, and I was very. I mean, Omicron was absolutely terrifying to be, because it was very transmissible, and there seemed a real risk that it would do a huge amount of damage to people. But what I'm trying to say is that around about the middle, the end of that month, I start to think that maybe it's less deadly, and there seemed indeed to be, that did indeed turn out to be the case, and we were lucky with Omicron.
The material shows, Mr. Johnson, that there were, as before, and you've addressed this issue, a number of bilateral meetings between yourself and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And one in particular, we have an email concerning a readout of a meeting between yourself and the Chancellor on the 18th of December, makes plain that, quote, you seem generally undecided. You raise a number of points on each side of the argument. This goes back to your stated tendency to try to ventilate both sides of an argument. The Chancellor, according to the readout, said ultimately this is a decision for the Prime Minister, but he personally remained unconvinced that there was a compelling case for significant restrictions, and that is ultimately, of course, what you indeed decided. There's been an article in the press dated August 22, which suggests that at that meeting, the Chancellor came as close as he could, or used the closest formulation of words that he could to imply that he would resign if there was another lockdown. Does that accord with your recollection?
No, I don't remember that.
The debate, of course, continued in government to the end of December, and you were presented with a paper concerning measures for January, and you expressed your scepticism for those additional measures in your habitual way by using expletive across the paper to describe what you thought of the measures. And on the 5th of January, you told Cabinet it was time to grip the handlebars tightly as the next few weeks would be bumpy, but the best option for the country was to get through the period without going back to restrictions. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I think that was entirely justified based on two things: what we were starting to learn about Omicron, but also, of course, on the vaccine rollout, which was by then, I think we'd vaccinated a huge number of people already.
Now, rule breaking. You supported Mr. Cummings when the Barnard Castle affair exploded in Easter 2020, did you not?
I did.
The material, the suggestion is that Mr. Cummings drove 250 miles to Durham over the weekend of the 27th, 28th, 29th of March at the height of the lockdown with his wife and child, and then on the 12th of April he drove to Barnard Castle. He has said that you knew that he had moved his family out of London on that weekend of the 27th of March. You, the inquiry is aware, have said in a WhatsApp with another official that Mr. Cummings is a total and utter liar. He never told me he'd gone to Durham during lockdown. I only discovered it when the stories came out. He claimed he'd told me, but that he said my brain was so fogged by COVID, I didn't register. But it's not true. I would have noted it. He never told me. Is that the position you take today?
That's what I remember.
The position, though, was, of course, that public confidence in your administration, the United Kingdom government, not, I should say, from the data, the Scottish or Welsh administrations or the Northern Ireland Executive, dipped significantly. There was a very notable drop in confidence in the competence of your government. That obviously was highly regrettable. In the height of a public health crisis of unprecedented proportions, to have that blow to the public confidence in your government's competence was obviously damaging.
It was a bad moment, and I won't pretend otherwise. But actually, I think that what happened thereafter was fascinating in that whatever the rights and wrongs of the position I took on that episode, people continued to want us to get on with the job of fixing the pandemic, and they continue. In spite of what you say about the confidence factor, they continued to be more than willing to work together to defeat the virus, and that's what they did.
Is that right, Mr. Johnson? The same data which established the significant drop in confidence in your government, data from UCL called the COVID-19 Social Study, also appeared to suggest a drop in self-reported adherence to guidance. So there was not just you would say a communication or political or presentation issue, there was a substantive impact.
Well, I can't quantify that. What is certainly true is, as we've discussed a lot over the last couple of days, all MPIs start to degrade over time. Public adherence starts to fray. Whether that episode helped to exacerbate that problem, to the extent to which it did, I just can't judge.
The inquiry, as is everybody well aware, of course, that then the first reports of social gatherings in Number 10 emerged in November of 2021. You were issued with a fixed penalty notice on the 12th of April 2022 relating to an event in Downing Street on the occasion of your birthday, the 19th of June 2020, just a few weeks after the Barnard Castle affair. Putting aside the issue of your own fixed penalty notice, did you, and it's important I ask you this, did you apologise for the impression that had been given that staff in Downing Street take the rules and the regulations less than seriously? You, in fact, I think, described yourself as sickened yourself and furious.
I did, and I repeated that on many occasions.
But you acknowledge, of course, that all the breaches proved to have taken place, but the general behaviour took place in Downing Street on your watch.
I do, but I wish to just to stress, and I've always it's been clear from everything I've said. I take full responsibility for everything that the government said or did during the pandemic. I continue to regret very much what happened, but I really want to emphasise, and you talk about the impression, the version of events that has entered the popular consciousness about what is supposed to have happened in Downing Street is a million miles from the reality of what actually happened in Number 10. And I speak on behalf of, I know, of hundreds and hundreds of hard-working civil servants who thought that they were following the rules. And I know, I don't think have been properly characterised by some of the, not just the media coverage, but the dramatic representations that we're now having of this are absolutely absurd. And I want to repeat that. They're a million miles from the reality of what happened.
Mr. Johnson, one of the problems is that I've received a number of messages from bereaved people as I've travelled around the United Kingdom, and so many of them who suffered horrific grief during lockdown. Yes. We all know that it's far more traumatic even than many other kinds of grief. And then I'm afraid Partygate has been called exacerbated.
Of course, and I totally understand their feelings, and what can I do but again apologise for mistakes that we made in Number 10. What I'm trying to tell you and to tell the inquiry is that I think that the characterisation, the representation there has been of what civil servants and advisors were doing in Number 10 has been a travesty of the truth. They thought they were working very, very hard, which they were, and I certainly thought that what we were doing was, as I've said before, within the rules. So that is in no way to to attempt to mitigate the offence that has been caused, and I understand the offence that has been caused, and I apologise for the offence that has been caused. And if I had my time again, of course I'd have done things differently in number 10, and I would have sent repeated messages round saying, please, make sure that everybody can see that you're properly following the guidance. So, frankly, I think, as some of your witnesses have said, it was logistically impossible to do that. But anyway,
Mr. Johnson,
I think people know my views on this.
you say it was a million miles away from the reality of Downing Street. One of your most competent and sterling civil servants, Helen McNamara, said in live evidence to my lady, I'd find it hard to pick one day when the regulations were followed properly inside that building.
But that's the point I'm making, because
Are you saying that this was all a matter of breaches of the regulations on account of
what if you look at carefully
the formulaic obligations of walking down corridors and having to work in the building structure of Downing Street?
If you read what Helen said in her evidence to you, I think actually that is what she was driving at. She says there was one meeting where we were able to do things strictly by the absolute letter of the guidance, and it was unsustainable, and that was why the guidance was written in a way so as to allow businesses to have flexibility. And the particulars, I mean, I've been around this issue many times, and forgive me, but the situation in Downing Street, the conditions of work there, we were having to call, as the inquiry has heard, meeting after meeting after meeting, at all hours of the day and night, in rapid succession, and summon people rapidly to different meetings. As Helen McNamara rightly says, in those conditions, it was very hard to follow the letter of the guidance, and I've tried to explain that many times. But I understand the offence that has been caused.
May we have 226239, page 13, please? This is around that time, the time in the revelation of the partying in Downing Street, a WhatsApp communication between yourself and your Cabinet Secretary. Your Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, was originally obligated to carry out an investigation, but for a variety of reasons which we needn't explore, he did not do so. But in the context of that debate at 23:04 on the 17th of December, Boris Johnson, in retrospect, we all should have told people, above all Lee Kane, to think about their behaviour in number 10 and how it would look. But now we must smash on. So that wasn't about technical breaches of the regulations because of the planning in Downing Street. It was a reference to behaviour, a behaviour of your officials and advisors, and you knew how it would look, but you didn't care that much.
I did care, and to say that I didn't care about what was happening generally is the complete opposite of the truth. And yes, I think that we could have done more in number 10 to insist that people thought about the way their behaviour would be perceived by others. And I made this point repeatedly to the various inquiries that have been held already into this matter. We should have thought about what it would look like to have people out in the garden when other people were not allowed in the garden, even though the garden was being used as a place of work. But the idea that I didn't, I mean, in your line of questioning, which has been of course excellent throughout, but you've dwelt particularly on WhatsApp exchanges and various things that I'm supposed to have said, which indicate that I didn't care. I did care, and I continue to care passionately about it. And I will, if you want, I haven't talked about this before in public, but and it goes to what you were saying earlier about elderly people and my what you claim is my indifference to the pandemic. I just want to remind you that when I went into intensive care, I saw around me a lot of people who were not actually elderly. In fact, they were middle-aged men, and they were quite like me. And some of us were going to make it, and some of us weren't. And what I'm trying to tell you, in a nutshell, and the NHS, thank God, did an amazing job and helped me survive. But I knew from that experience what an appalling disease this is. I had absolutely no personal doubt about that from March onwards. To say that I didn't care about the suffering that was being inflicted on the country is simply not right.
Mr. Johnson, I have never suggested you didn't care about the suffering. I suggested you didn't care about the reaction to the behaviour demonstrated, a clear reference on the face of that WhatsApp.
Well, I thank you for that clarification.
My lady.
Thank you. Mr. Weatherby, I think you're going to ask some questions, and then Ms. Campbell. I want to make sure that we don't have too long a morning.
I'm happy to crack on as long as you are and the stenographer and Mr. Johnson is.
So if we crack on for about 20 minutes?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Mr. Johnson, I am going to ask you some questions on behalf of about 7,000 bereaved family members from across England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, who are supporters of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, a group which eventually you did meet with at one point. I'm going to ask you questions for about 20 minutes, and some of the points that I'm going to ask you about have been touched upon by Mr. Keith, so I hope that you and I can collaborate in dealing with them effectively. I want to go back to a point that Mr. Keith raised with you about as part of your statement where you say, it's paragraph 15, where you say that the United Kingdom has defied most of the gloomier predictions and has ended the pandemic, or the most serious phases of it, well down the global league tables for excess mortality. Now, at the end of your exchange with Mr. Keith, my understanding was that you basically stood by that statement. Is that right?
Well, first thing to say is how glad I am that you and the representatives of the bereaved families are here and taking such a big part in these proceedings. I think that's a good thing, and I think it's very valuable for the inquiry. On the data, whatever the data may say, one death is a tragedy.
Yes.
There were too many. I was merely making the point that I thought that the statistics are. I've seen several tables that seem to confirm what I was saying, and I point you to another one by the Lancet, giving roughly the same impression.
Okay. My question was, you stand by the statement that you made?
I do.
Yes. So, as far as I can see, in a very lengthy statement no problem with that. But you don't actually provide much of a basis for that statement. So I want to just probe it a little bit further, if that's all right with you. And I want to put up a document. I'm going to actually put up a very small number of documents to you in my time, but I do want you to look at this one. It's 292765, and it's page 10, please. And just while it's going up, this is a graph that's been provided at the inquiry's direction, and it deals with this very issue, and it's the comparative position of the UK internationally. Now, an earlier witness told us that you have some difficulty with graphs, so whether that's right or not, don't worry, I'm going to actually point out the points that I want to raise with you, but I wanted you to be able to see it. But this is the comparative position of the United Kingdom, age standardised for excess deaths with other European countries over the period January 2020 to July 2022. And what it does is it shows that 18 months into the pandemic, it gives two points. It shows that 18 months into the pandemic, the United Kingdom was 9th highest out of the 33 countries in terms of its excess death adjusted. And then it dropped to 15th after 30 months. So it did get better. But the important point that I want to highlight and want fairly put to you with the document in front of you is that only Italy, amongst comparable countries, had a higher excess mortality rate. So it's right that the UK is in the middle of that graph, but in terms of comparable countries, only Italy has a higher mortality rate, and you'd agree with that, I assume, looking at that graph.
Well, I don't quite understand what you mean by comparable in that context.
Okay, well, let me explain then. It's important, of course, that we don't compare apples with pears, as I'm sure you'll agree. So if it's right, your statement, the UK defied most of the gloomier predictions, your words, we would be looking at comparisons, wouldn't we, with countries like France or Belgium or the Netherlands,
if you look at
rather than Bulgaria or Poland, which are very different countries. I'm not deprecating Bulgaria or Poland.
What are you doing with Bulgaria then?
But I'm asking you, if you're going to say that the UK defied the gloomier predictions, then the real comparison is with countries such as France or Belgium or Spain or Germany. Is that right?
Well, if you look at the point I was making, and which I stand by, is that the UK, the tables I've seen, actually comes about halfway down. And it's not just this table, it's I think there was a Lancet study as well. I think the former health secretary alludes to it in his evidence. This is not in any way to diminish the pain and the suffering of people who lost family members during COVID.
I understand
it is simply to point out. It is simply to mount. It is to reflect the enormous effort made by the whole of the UK to protect the NHS and save lives.
Can we stick to the question?
And I believe that it did.
Can we stick to the question? You've raised this in your statement. You made a sweeping assertion that the UK defied the more gloomy predictions. I'm putting to you some cold steel of evidence, and that's what I'm trying to do here.
Well, I don't believe that I don't believe that your evidence stacks up.
Okay.
And I think that actually, if you look at,
could we just pause, please, Mr. Weatherby, Mr. Johnson? I'm sorry. I know that emotions are running high, but I have to ask those in the public gallery to keep quiet, whatever their emotions, because it's going to disrupt the proceedings and it affects the live feed, the streaming for other people who are trying to follow. I'm really sorry. I do understand, but it has to stop. All right?
Thank you, milady. Now, Mr. Johnson, the point I'm getting at is that you've raised this. I'm actually now trying to present some evidence. The inquiry has sought this evidence itself. Now, before you, I'll give you the opportunity to answer. But this evidence is based on ONS, Office of National Statistics material, and Eurostat material that they've got. And there's a document accompanying this. I'm not going to put it up. It's quite a detailed document, but it's been provided to the inquiry. I'll give it for the record. It's 271350. But that explains the basis of these figures. The age standardisation, which deals with the difference of population and difference of age spread. And it deals with the robustness of the international data that is used. So these are, I'm putting to you, the gold standard of the evidence in respect to this. It deals with excess deaths, not just COVID deaths. It deals with excess deaths over the period. So you haven't put forward any evidence to justify your assertion. Why are you questioning this?
I'm not questioning this. This shows, first of all, this shows exactly what I said it shows, which is that if you look at the European tables, we come about halfway down. Secondly, actually, if you look at the data, for instance, that the former Health Secretary, Mr. Hancock, cites in his own evidence, the Lancet study, you can see that the UK, France, and Germany and the tables for excess mortality are grouped very close together, and I think Italy sadly has a little bit more, and the Netherlands has a little bit more. Other nations a little bit more. The interesting thing for me is how at the end of it all, a prophecy by Chris Whitty was proved correct when he said that the UK would probably end for excess mortality around about the middle of the pack.
Yeah.
And that is indeed what has happened.
Okay.
And that does not in any way diminish the individual tragedies of people who have lost lives.
You've said that, but just dealing with these ONS statistics, this is what the King's Fund said. Now, the King's Fund, as I'm sure you know, is a prestigious independent healthcare institution, said well over a century ago. This is what it said. These figures show that although all European countries have experienced devastating death tolls from COVID, and the impacts varied geographically in terms of timing and magnitude, excess mortality in the United Kingdom during the pandemic exceeded that of most comparable Western European countries. And it went on, the UK also had the highest excess mortality rate compared with the baseline among people under 65 in Western European countries, such as France, Belgium, and Sweden. So I'm going to move on, but I'll put it to you once more that this gold standard of the data available does not support what you say in your statement, does it?
Well, I think, with great respect, I think that actually it does. And what I was responding to in my, and if you look at the Lancet document, the Lancet study, the UK is, I think, about 102nd of 190 or so countries. But in a way, I think this argument is irrelevant. All I was trying to do was to. I didn't want the inquiry to run away with the impression that there was something uniquely awful about the performance of the UK's services.
I've put the evidence to you. I've put it from what I'm describing as the gold standard. I've indicated to you that it's age standardised, it's excess deaths. One further point on this. Looking at the global picture, the Johns Hopkins University Institute of Medicine has done a review or a research per head of population. The UK comes out as number 20 in its global table of 173 countries for COVID. And similarly, the Worldometer website, which is a data set provider, which includes providing data to the UK government, has the UK at number 18 out of 231 countries. So again, the UK did far worse than you're trying to suggest, didn't it, Mr. Johnson?
I don't agree with that, and I think that if you look at the age of the UK population, as I said earlier in my evidence, the comorbidities that we sadly have, the density of the UK population.
Well, let's look at that.
I think that the original prophecy of the chief medical officer has turned out to be broadly correct.
Okay, well, let's look at that. You raise age and density. South Korea, a comparatively wealthy country of 52 million people, has an older population than the UK. It has a population density of almost twice the UK, and it had a quarter of the UK's deaths.
Can I try? I'll venture an explanation for
Absolutely.
that. And I think the answer is well known to people who followed it, and that is because, in no way to detract from the wonderful efforts of South Korean healthcare, but they already had substantial experience of plague, SARS, and other such diseases, and were well prepared, and arguably better prepared than the UK.
Yes.
To tackle something like this. If you look at the, notwithstanding what you say, if you look at the comparator countries in Europe, you haven't mentioned the United States, which had significantly higher mortality. The UK, given the elderliness of the population, the comorbidities, I do not think it is fair to say that the UK did significantly worse than others.
With respect, that's deflecting from my point, isn't it, by going off and talking about another country? I've given you the full picture here and asked you to comment on it.
I'm giving you... Sorry, you asked me for my opinion about South Korea. Now you're saying that I shouldn't be talking about another country.
No. Well, okay, South Korea, that segues me into my next point about what happened in March. So it was only by mid-March, wasn't it, that the United Kingdom government was serious about sourcing ventilators and oxygen supply and PPE and protective clothing. And it had failed to source anywhere near enough tests, as evidenced by much of the evidence that no doubt you've followed in this inquiry. That's the reality. You got to mid-March without having addressed all of these issues of testing and PPE.
Well, it took a long time before we had a convenient lateral flow test that everybody could use anyway, and that it took a while before that had been devised, partly thanks to work done at Porton Down.
Well,
and yes, it is. But yes, and I think it's one of the things that the inquiry needs to focus on is, yes, our diagnostics industry and capability was not strong enough at the time COVID broke.
No doubt.
That's absolutely true.
No doubt.
One of the legacies, and I should have said this since you've mentioned test, it allows me to segue conveniently into a point I wanted to make but didn't. Actually, what happened was that we went up massively in our ability to test people.
Yes, later.
By the end of that year, we were doing, I think, 300,000 by September and 500,000 people.
Okay, let's stick to the point.
And since you make other comparisons with other countries,
yes,
it is worth bearing in mind.
Okay, but
our
stick to the point.
Our testing ability was by far the biggest in Europe.
Okay, going back to the point about South Korea, by mid-March, South Korea had actually tested 5 times the number of people that the UK had tested. And the reason for that was partly because they had a history of learning from SARS and MERS, which apparently the UK hadn't. But also because you and the government had not seen the COVID coming over the horizon. You had seen it, but you hadn't acted on it. I mean, paragraph 46 of your statement, looking back, it's clear that we vastly underestimated the risks in those early weeks. if we'd properly understood how fast COVID was spreading, and the fact that it was spreading asymptomatically, there are many things we would have done differently. If we realised that what this virus could do, then we would have immediately laid down stocks of PPE, checked PHE had diagnostic abilities, started the race for a vaccine and started to socialise the public with the idea that they were going to have to do NPIs. That's your own words, that you failed to act on things like ramping up testing and PPE until it was too late.
So what my words say is that we didn't know at the time what we needed to do. But even had we known, we would not have been able, in the time available, to build up anything like the diagnostics capabilities that were necessary for a test and trace scheme. And the test and trace system was rapidly overwhelmed in every European country.
Well, the problem is you hadn't got started with it, Mr. Johnson. That's what you're saying in your self-reflection in your statement, isn't it? The reality is.
No, that's not true. We had a test and trace system, and we could already test and trace people, but it was nothing like big enough. And what I hope will be one of the legacies of this exercise is that we will have a much bigger diagnostics industry, as indeed we now do.
But the reality is that your government was reactive, not to what was on the horizon, but what was there in the here and now. And you just reacted too late to provide PPE, source PPE, or source testing. And isn't that the reality of it?
No. As soon as we understood the scale of the problem, we shifted heaven and earth to get both things. I think by the end of the year, I think it was something like 35 billion items of PPE that we'd.
By the 5th of April, the BBC were reporting, still on the website, headline: coronavirus, the NHS workers wearing bin bags as protection. 3 days later, the Daily Telegraph ran a similar article. Even after the first lockdown had started, you were woefully short of PPE and testing because you hadn't reacted when it came on the horizon in January, ramped up testing capacity, ramped up PPE.
No, so even if we'd appreciated, and I've told you, I've explained that we didn't understand the scale and the pace of the virus's advance. But even if we had, I don't believe that it would have made that much difference in January, because the stocks were not great around the world. And if you remember what happened, we had a terrible situation in March when there were struggles virtually at airports over consignments of PPE to make sure they went from one country to one country rather than.
The documents show that at the beginning of March, which is when you first started to chair COBRA and you went to the hospital shaking hands with COVID patients, at the beginning of March, that the CCS, Civil Service Secretariat, was still scoping matters such as PPE and testing. By the 26th of April, well into a month into the first lockdown, there's a private email between you and Dominic Cummings, where you say that the T&T, the test and trace plans, were, quote, whistling in the dark with, quote, legions of imaginary Clouseaus and no plan to hire them, and an app that doesn't work. And finally this, a quote, we got to turn it around. That's what you were saying a month into lockdown about testing.
Well, what I was also being told, if you think about the evidence that had been given to me to begin with, I was being told that we did have a very good test and trace system. I was told that we had ample preparations, and that turned out not to be true. So what you're rightly quoting is me responding to the reality and telling the system that we've got to go up several gears and sort it out.
Just for the record, the reference is 226, 628 at page 21. But what you're doing there is you're saying the stable door's open, the horse is bolted, and you're realising that there's no plans in place to ramp up the testing. You've told us this morning that in early March you didn't realise where on the curve you were. Now, part of the reason for that is that the UK didn't have enough tests.
Sorry. The UK's diagnostics industry was not as well developed when the pandemic began as others. That's absolutely correct.
And your government didn't do anything about it.
And that was because I was being told in those early weeks that we were well covered. And I think if you look at what Chief Medical Officer had to say, what Yvonne Doyle had to say at around that time, you can see that they believe that we have a big testing capability.
Okay.
And that was what I was picking up. That turned out not to be true. We reacted. We then set up one of the biggest testing, well, I think probably certainly the biggest testing industries in Europe. And I want to thank Dido Harding very much for everything that she did.
Well,
she did a tremendous
I put the point to you.
And I want to thank Paul Dighton for what he did on securing PPE.
You're deflecting again, Mr. Johnson, aren't you?
No, I'm telling you what we did.
I'm going to move on to a final point, if I may. And I'd like you to look, it's a different point, jumping to September, the 11th of September. Can we have up on the screen, please, 280061, page 153. Now, this is September. Mr. Keith dealt with much of this, so I can deal with it very quickly. This is a page from Professor Valence's diaries relating to that day. I'll read it just through quickly. 11th of September, schools data reviewed on the dashboard. You say, what am I being told? Is this a great triumph? Mr. Hancock says, yes, a great triumph. Professor Valence comments, care homes upward spiking cases over the past few days. Here we go again. You say, and this is the critical point, or one of two critical points here, you say, we need to remember the grim history of March. And then Professor Valence called for a package of actions. Mr. Hancock refers to care home winter plan. And then you say, everyone says the rule of six is so unfair, punishing the young, but fuck you, Daily Mail.
I apologise for my language.
OK, well, it's in shouty capitals and underlined.
Well, not by me.
By Professor Valence. Look, this is all about stopping deaths. We need to tell them. Hospital admissions are clearly beginning to increase. First of all, do you recall this and the flavour of it being accurate?
No, but what I can tell you, if indeed it is accurate, is that what I would have been saying is that this is September.
Yeah.
We're in a. You can see as I was saying earlier to Mr. Keith, to the inquiry, you can see the risk that the virus is going to start taking off again. I'm extremely
That's
worried.
Exactly what I'm putting it to you for.
And with great respect to you, sir, it looks to me as though what I'm saying here is that the priority is to, and I'm sorry to have said this about the Daily Mail, but the priority is to stop deaths.
Well, wait for the question. You were there recognising that we were back in a position not dissimilar to March. You're also recognising, with the reference to part of the media, that you've got competing pressures, aren't you? That's what's going on. So you're saying let's look for a package of measures.
I just for the avoidance of doubt, I don't think that this is meant to be a general criticism of that great organ.
I'm not suggesting it is.
The press, the Daily Mail. There had presumably been something that they had said that had wound me up about the rule of six or whatever.
Here you're
and what I was saying was we need restrictions. And I think probably what I'm saying is, which I then did, because on the 9th, I say that we've got to have
Yes,
the rule of
that's where I'm going with this, Mr. Johnson. You're recognising you've not got your head somewhere else. You're recognising the problem. You're back in a position not dissimilar to March. You're recognising something has to be done, and you're recognising there's opposition to that. So you've got this tension. That's right, isn't it? That's what this reflects.
And that's what was
Yes,
at the heart of the whole debate.
Then,
of course.
And then we get.
But I hope that everybody that you so ably represent understand. My priority was saving lives.
But then we get to the 21st of September with SAGE recommending this circuit breaker. Just 10 days later, circuit breaker with a attached package, and you reject it. You go with a tier system, which you never refer back to SAGE. SAGE never gets to look at SAGE.
Sir, great respect. I think I can repeat, if you like, what I said to the Council for the Inquiry. But the gist of it is that I thought there were downsides to the proposed circuit breaker. It wasn't as simple as all that. It was immensely destructive. The risk was you'd have to keep doing it, as they themselves acknowledged. The Health Secretary himself didn't support it, and I thought that the best thing for at least for a while was to see if we could intensify the national measures and then go to.
Yes, you've said that. Just this before I sit down, that what this demonstrates is that you understand the problem. You're caught in this tension between two sides, and you delay, and you're indecisive.
No.
And the actual proper measures that bring R down eventually are punted off until the infection has spread, and more people die.
I respectfully say that's total rubbish. And but I've tried to deal with that argument. I don't think it stacks up. I think if you look at both the timing of events in March, the sequence of things that we did, then the sequence of things that we did in September, October, November, they were reasonable. Our priority was to protect the NHS and save lives. And by the way, unlike some other countries, we did not have our healthcare system overwhelmed. And in that respect, at least, unlike the scenes we saw in some other countries, the healthcare system was not overwhelmed in this country. And in that respect, I think that the efforts of the British people paid off.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much. We'll break now. The stenographer's had too long a morning, and I'm sorry for that. Mr. Johnson, this afternoon, when you do answer the questions, I appreciate it's very difficult, but keep your answers slower, because the
I will. Okay.
is trying to keep up. And I don't want to have to repeat my warnings. Please heed what I said this morning, because otherwise I'm going to have to ask other people to leave, and that is the last thing I want to do. Ms Campbell.
Mr Johnson, my name is Brenda Campbell and I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved Families for Justice, which means that I ask questions on behalf of people who are members of a club that they never wished to be members of, but having become members by virtue of their bereavement, they have campaigned for this inquiry. They have listened intently to all the evidence, including yours, in search for answers. And I want you to understand that the questions that I ask are asked on their behalf. And so if I may, can I ask you please to answer with clarity and with brevity those questions on their behalf? To put it bluntly, Mr Johnson, where a one-word answer is sufficient, I'll take it. It's plain from your evidence today and yesterday that you have followed a great deal of the evidence at this inquiry and that Her Ladyship has heard. You told us yesterday that you have seen the impact video that was played at the start of this module, and the impact of long COVID was reflected powerfully in that. You'll also recall, having watched that it captured the experience of our client, Martina Ferguson, who lost her mother, Ursula Derry, on the 4th of January 2021. But can I ask you, have you also listened to and watched the oral evidence from the bereaved in this module and in Module 1?
No.
Well, the question might be, why not?
Because I'm afraid I haven't been able to watch all the evidence in this inquiry.
Had you watched it, in Module 1, you would have heard the evidence of Brenda Doherty about the loss of her mother, Ruth. And at the outset of this module on the 5th of October, you would have heard the evidence of Katrina Miles, who lost her father, Gerard McLarnon, 3 years ago, in fact, this month. And if you continue to listen to further modules, you'll hear stories of further bereavement that Her Ladyship has invited to be told, understanding the pain and the distress that families feel. But one of Miss Miles's points that she told us about was a galling juxtaposition of being told on the 18th of December 2020 that her father, aged 67, was going to die in the coming days from COVID, and that he died alone. His time of death is not known. 5 days later, on the 23rd of December. The juxtaposition that she told us about, that in her words was sickening, was that on the 18th of December, there were one of several Christmas events in Downing Street and around the area to have taken place that month. This particular event was a wine and cheese party and a secret Santa during a so-called business meeting. Do you understand, and on behalf of the bereaved, really understand the idea that many of those who were denied the possibility of saying goodbye to loved ones, whilst at the same time those making the draconian rules were to be seen to be flouting them, is, as Miss Miles told us, galling and sickening? Do you understand that?
Thank you. And the short answer is, as I told the chairman of the inquiry, yes, I do understand people's pain and people's offence, of course.
You see, sadly, her experience and that of her family is far from unique. The revelations of the unlawful parties and gatherings in Downing Street have, as Her Ladyship has acknowledged this morning, compounded the distress and the grief felt by families who were denied the opportunity either to say a final goodbye, or to host a wake, or to host a funeral for their loved ones. If you do understand that, as you tell us you do, why was it allowed to happen?
Thank you. I've extensively tried to explain how I think that came about and why I think the people who were working in Downing Street for a very long time and very hard believed that they were working within the rules at the time. Though, as I say to you to those you represent, and again to the to Mane. I understand fully the point that you are making, and I regret it very much.
I'm going to move on from this topic, but it's perhaps important to note that by the 18th of December 2020, there had been 86,886 COVID-related deaths that year. This, I'm going to suggest, is not a matter of hindsight. It was plain that the country and that those who were bereaved were in extreme pain and distress. Could you have done more to stop it?
To stop the pandemic?
The gatherings, the Partygate, the wine and cheese parties, the Secret Santas, the pub quizzes or the Zoom quizzes.
I had no knowledge of the event on the 18th at the time.
That was not my question.
At the time that it took place.
Could you have done more to stop it?
I think that the trouble was, as I've said, that people were working extremely hard in
Mr. Johnson, I'm going to. We've heard that.
If I'd had
my question is,
sorry, please go ahead.
And this may be one where a yes or no answer would suffice. Could you have done more to stop it?
I think the answer to that is that, given what I knew at the time about what was going on, the answer to that is no. But what I possibly should have done is issued a general instruction to everybody to be mindful of the rules and how things would appear. And as I say, I think in one of the WhatsApps that was earlier quoted by the counsel to the inquiry, that's my view.
That WhatsApp was dated almost exactly 1 year later, on the 17th of December 2021.
Ms Campbell, you need to move on.
I'm
You've gone
moving
beyond
on.
my permitted
Yes.
questions already.
On the keeping on the theme, if we may, of perhaps not doing quite enough, may I return to the issue of your communications with the devolved administrations? And you touched on this yesterday. You told us why, in your view, COBRAs at which the leaders of the devolved administrations attended were not working, and we heard about the concern of leaks and so on. But you knew when COBRAs were stopped in May 2020 that left no formal means by which you could meet the leaders of the devolved administrations in the middle of this global pandemic. You understood that, didn't you?
I don't think that's quite true. There were obviously plenty of opportunities in which I could meet the leaders of the devolved administrations. Had excellent relations both with Michelle and Arlene Foster, but as the inquiry has heard, we tried to split the labour.
Well, in fact, the decision, if you call it to split the labour, and the consequence of it was that between May and October, September 2020, you didn't have any direct meetings with the leaders of the devolved administrations. That's a fact.
Well, meetings themselves were quite difficult.
Well, but the point that I'm making to you, Mr. Johnson, is that the point of stopping the COBRAs and replacing them with Four Nations calls at which you would not be present nor participate was a deliberate decision to manage the devolved administrations.
It was my judgment that the DAs, and with whom we had excellent relations, and I think that overwhelmingly things worked well across the UK. But I thought that the CDL was well placed to deal with them, and he did.
So the answer to my question, that it was a deliberate decision, is yes.
Yes.
And it was deliberate because we've heard yesterday it was, in your view at the time, optically wrong. It was, as you told us in your statement, more importantly because you, in that way, would not be communicating directly with the First Minister of Scotland. And it was deliberate